Time we're looking at major themes. Last week we looked at the idea that God is viable, but in our application he's often not reliable, or at least we don't act like he's reliable. This week we're going to look at a new theme as we go through the Bible together, and that theme is this: we have a tendency to give up on God. We have a tendency to give up on God even though he doesn't give up on us. Now there are many ways we give up on God. Some of us give up on God because of the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia series and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you may have read that or seen the movie, was a famous Christian apologist or famous Christian philosopher. And he wrote a book about all the reasons why Christianity has a solution to the problem of evil. And yet, about 20 years later, his wife died. And then he wrote another book called Grief Observed. And in this book, he wrestled with whether or not God exists. He wrestled with whether or not God was trustworthy. He wrestled with whether or not he could really rely on God during difficult times in his life. In fact, in his book, Grief Observed, he says this. He says, I not only lived each day in endless grief, but I lived each day thinking about living each day in endless grief. It's the thing about depression or grief or doubts is you not only doubt, but then you worry about the fact that you're doubting. You not only grieve, but then you grieve the fact that you're grieving. C.S. Lewis said he almost gave up on God because of the problem of evil. Others of us give up on God, and this is going to sound so weird. We give up on God because we think we're good enough. You see, the main message of the Bible says that we are not good enough, and we need someone to rescue us. And that is so foreign to the human mind because we always say to ourselves, well, I'm basically a good person. Everybody I know is basically a good person, well, except that person who I'm mad at. Everybody thinks they're basically a good person. And when the Bible comes and says, no, you're not, and you need somebody to be good enough for you, most people give up on that message. They give up on the Bible. They're offended by that idea. They give up on God because of their goodness. About a month ago, right before our children's musical, a guy stopped me on the way in. He says, I got a question for you. I said, oh, great, I love questions. He said, how can I know for sure I'm going to heaven? I said, well, what makes you think you're getting to heaven? I think, how does one qualify to get into heaven? He says, well, I'm basically a good person. I said, oh, I'm glad I found one. I don't know any basically good people. Now tell me, I break all 10 commandments the way Jesus described them every single day. Every day, I break all 10 commandments. I have other things besides God I make number one in my life. I covet after things that are not mine. I lust after things that I shouldn't. I have a tendency to fudge the truth and manipulate and lie. And I'm not proud of that fact, but I'm not basically a good person. How did you do it? I mean, do you not struggle with these things? Well, yeah, I do struggle with those things. Oh. He said, well, I guess I'm not basically a good person. I said, oh, well, then the Bible has a great message for you. The message of the Bible is when we give up on God and we're honest about it, we find a God who doesn't give up on us. I remember Scott and Tracy came into my office. Here at Horizon, we have a team of pastors and volunteers that meet with folks for premarital counseling, but back at my last church, I had a tendency to do a lot of that myself. And they asked me if I would perform the ceremony for their marriage, and Scott grew up in a religious background, and Tracy did not. They both were executives. One had a small business. The other worked in a textile industry. And she was still kicking the tires on Christianity and whether or not it was true. And I performed the ceremony, and that next year, something got unleashed in their life that was just horrific. See, Scott began to sell off all the parts of his small business to buy more and more cocaine. He'd kept that habit hidden from her for their 10-year friendship at the time. Tracy would come over to her house and she was exploring the Bible, exploring Jesus, and her whole world was coming apart as her husband had lied, cheated, stolen from his mom and his sister to get more and more money for drugs. And he was the religious one. See, her husband had given up on God and his ways, and yet she was still trying to figure out whether God was really real. My wife and I cried with her and searched with her for the next year, and she came to the moment where she accepted Christ as her forgiver and her leader, and she found strength and comfort. And I'll tell you this, a year later, as I walked with Scott, I talked to him this week, Scott came to the end of himself. He got restored to his God. He got restored to his family. He overcame addiction. And I said, Scott, what is the one thing you learned through this whole journey? And he said, I gave up on God. but he didn't give up on me. And that is true whether you're struggling with suffering, whether you think you're good enough, or whether or not you're struggling with rebellion, giving up on God's ways. God doesn't give up on us when we give up on him. And that's where we find ourselves this morning. If you have your tic-tac-toe board, you can open that up, and we're going to draw the first picture on the top left. Because where we left off last week was that God had brought Moses and all the people out into the wilderness. And in the wilderness, he was going to teach them that he had a standard. He had a standard, but they fell very, very short of that standard. So he set up a tabernacle in the book of Exodus to show them that though they fell short, though they could not be good enough, though they had given up on him, he had not given up on them. And he made a series of sacrifices and tabernacles that people who fell short of him could be restored to him. People who fell short of his standards could come and find him again. And the book of Leviticus lays out God's holiness or God's purity or God's righteousness and shows that God's standards are so high, we don't even live up to our own standards, let alone God's standards. And yet there would be a series of offerings and sacrifices that would foreshadow a final sacrifice and final offering that could make us right with God. And then he brings the people up to the promised land. The promised land he told Abraham about. And he said, I want you to go in. And they sent in 12 spies, and 10 of the spies went in, and 10 spies said, we can't trust God. And one of the reasons they felt like they couldn't trust God was because of the huge warriors that they found in there, the huge giants that they found in there, and the fortified cities. And they said, we feel like grasshoppers compared to the obstacles before us. And God said, well, I took care of the Red Sea, and I took care of the Pharaoh. You can trust me. Don't give up on me. And 10 of the spies said, we got to give up on God. We feel like grasshoppers. But 2 people, Caleb and Joshua, said, don't give up on God. Let's trust that he's bigger than our obstacles. He's bigger than the giants. He's bigger than the fortified cities. But they give up on God. The people take a vote and they decide not to go into the promised land. 400 plus years of waiting. And they decided to give up on God, to give up on his plan, to give up on what he said would happen. Which moves us into the book of Numbers. And the book of Numbers is the time at which the people wandered. And they wandered for 40 years. And for 40 years, during that time of wandering, if you were to sum it up in one word, it would be this: they grumbled. They grumbled for 40 years. You see, and this may sound weird, but most of us give up on God through grumbling. We grumble because we know better how to run the universe. And so we feel like we have the right to say, God, you're not serving me right. And we grumble at him, and we complain, and we're not thankful. We send mission trips all around the world here at Horizon. And every time the women come back from Mexico to help orphans, or students come back from back to back helping the needy, they say, I can't believe how unthankful we are in America. Well, the book of Numbers, they complain, they grumble. They grumble about food. They grumble about the water. They grumble about not having enough meat. They grumble about Moses' leadership. And they grumble about how good the days were in bondage back in Egypt. And yet, when they give up on God through grumbling, God doesn't give up on them. God continues to provide manna for them. He continues to appear to them in a pillar of fire and direct them. He continues, when they do ask him for food, despite giving up on him, he provides quail hail that come down upon them. They need water, he makes a fountain for them. Over and over and over again, despite they've given up on him, God doesn't give up on them. He comes near them even in the midst of their grumbling. Well, at the end of the book of Numbers, Joshua is still alive. And Joshua says, let's be the generation that doesn't give up on God. And this new generation say, let's go into the promised land and let's trust God. And they do. And as they go into the land, 40 years later, we find that there are still fortified cities. There are still big obstacles. In fact, one of the biggest obstacles are some of these fortified cities and walls. So Joshua sends in spies. His spies are to search out the best strategy. And they come to a city named Jericho. And as they come into the city is just filled with injustice and wickedness and evil, things at which we've never been exposed to here in America. It says that God has waited for 400 years for them to turn to him and to turn away from their evil ways. As the 2 spies come in, there's a woman living there who has given up on God. Her name is Rahab, and she's a prostitute. She says, I've heard about your God. I've heard about his power. I've heard about his might. I've heard about the Red Sea crossing. But I know a God like that wouldn't be interested in me. I'm a prostitute. The things I've done, the things I've participated in. And the two spies say, well, you may have given up on God, but he hasn't given up on you. In fact, if you want to get to know our God, all you need to do is give up. Surrender. Surrender to him. Admit you've fallen short. Admit you want to trust him for deliverance. And if you do that, if you put out the white flag of surrender, God won't give up on you. And so she lays out a scarlet cord. And sure enough, as the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, the family that is rescued is the family who chose to giving up on God. And Rahab is rescued. And so powerful is Rahab's story that though she is a prostitute, and though she is a woman, and though she is a foreigner, Jesus will show up in the book of Matthew, and Rahab will be in his family tree. Jesus will proudly say, she's with me. Jesus will proudly say, Rahab trusted in me. She'd given up on me, but I had not given up on her. Well, the book of Joshua is divided up into 24 chapters. And after they conquer Jericho, the number 12 becomes important. The first 12 chapters are battles, battling the evil Canaanites, battling the Philistines. And as these battles go on for the first 12 chapters, then the second 12 chapters, they take the 12 tribes that we learned about last week, and these 12 tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, were how the families were distributed, and he begins to distribute them into the land. So first 12 books, they fight the battles. The second 12 books, they distribute the land amongst the 12 tribes. So imagine that this chapel here is the land. And he says, all right, Benjamin, here it comes. You got that section. Dan, you got this section. And over for the next 12 chapters, he will distribute the land to all the different people and all the different tribes. Here you go. He says, Joseph, your tribe gets this section. Reuben, your tribe gets this section. There you go. Gad, you're over here. And over for 12 chapters, he will distribute all of the tribes to all the different land. And then he ends the book of Joshua with a speech. And he gives his own fast track Bible. He says, guys, let me give you the fast track. We have a history of giving up on God. Adam gave up on God. Abraham gave up on God. Moses gave up on God. We all give up on God, and yet he doesn't give up on us. Therefore, he says, I don't know about you, but as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Even though we've had a history of giving up on God, we are just so indebted to his forgiveness. Even though our whole people has a history of giving up on God, he has never given up on us. So I don't know about your allegiance, but my allegiance is to love a God who never gave up on me. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that is where the book of Joshua ends, with this powerful speech by Joshua, distributing the land to the 12 tribes, saying we give up on God, but he doesn't give up on us. Which moves into a time called the time of the Judges. There's a book written about it, and it's called the book of Judges. And the book of Judges could be summarized like this. The people give up on God. For 350 years, all of a sudden they have prosperity. They have wells. They have a promised land. They have money. They have material. And the problem is when you get successful, when you get rich, when you have all your needs met, we have a tendency to give up on God. He becomes irrelevant. He becomes not important. I mean, maybe he's nice to have in the background, but who really needs him? So God begins to send these judges, which were like pastors and military leaders combined, if that doesn't sound too scary. And these judges would come because what would happen is that in those days, when they said, God, get away from me, God would step away. And then Midianites or Philistines would come in and begin to conquer them. And they'd say, whoa, 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 God, help us. Sorry we gave up on you. And he says, all right, I have not given up on you. And he sends judges to rescue them. And the message of the judges is this. Stop running. Stop running. Stop giving up on me. And instead, return to me. Make a U-turn. Stop running and return to me. And Deborah will come along and she'll say, stop running and return to me. God wants to be with you. And they'll come to victory and then they'll get prosperous and they'll lose track again. Gideon will show up. And Gideon, he gave up on God because of fear. Long ago, he assumed that God had given up on him and given up on his nation. And one day, God comes to him and says, although you've given up on me, I haven't given up on you. Gideon, come on, put an army together. I want to use you to do mighty things. So he puts together an army, and God says, it's too big. You're going to take credit. Make it smaller. And he whittles it down to 300 people. And 300 people take torches, and they stick torches in these pots, and they surround the Midianite camp at night. And the Midianite army is humongous. And God tells them to trust him. And that night they smash the pots, and all of a sudden the Midianites awaken, and the entire place is surrounded with torches. And they assume this must be a massive army. It's only 300 people. And the Midianites are so confused at night, they kill each other off, thinking each other are the enemy, and God delivers the people. And Gideon returns. He says, guys, we gave up on God, but he didn't give up on us. He delivered an incredible, weird, and unique victory. Stop running and return to him. And over those 350 years, that pattern continues. The people run from him, and he says, stop. And he sends a judge, Micah and Jephthah and Gideon and others. But probably the most famous judge during this time is our next judge. Now, what's ironic about this time, it's a time of relativism, a time that every man did what was right in their own eyes. Much like we live in today. There's no right or wrong. We know better than God or that archaic book. Therefore, we're going to do our own thing. But every time the people did their own thing, they didn't get more free. They got more enslaved. More enslaved to their addictions, more enslaved to their choices, more enslaved to all the things they thought would make them happy. Much like you and I. Well, even the judges, the ones who were supposed to lead the people back to God, even the judges themselves had given up on God. This particular judge, who I always imagine talking like Arnold Schwarzenegger, there he is, it's Samson. Samson was a judge. He was a mighty man. Samson was a miraculous baby because his parents had been barren. And God sent Samson to them. And as Samson came to them, Samson was to be used by God to tell people, we've given up on God, but he hasn't given up on us. Let's trust him again. And he was to lead the people to victory over the evil Philistines who would come in after a year's crop, and right when it was time to get your harvest, they would rob you of all your land, destroying your property rights, robbing you of your food, starving the Israelites. Incredible wickedness. And Samson was commissioned by God to rescue the people from injustice. But Samson, who was strong enough to defeat an entire army with the jawbone of a donkey, Samson, who was able to, one day he was trapped inside of a city and he took the city gates off, put him on his back, and he was able to throw him into a ditch. That's how much strength he had. And yet Samson gave up on God because of his addictions and because of his appetites. He struggled with anger his whole life. He got so mad at his fiancée, he broke off the marriage and he burned the place down with foxes, with torches tied between their tails. He finds himself constantly visiting prostitutes. In fact, that story where you see him throwing the city gate is because he was visiting prostitutes, Philistine prostitutes at the time. His entire life, you see him consumed by his appetite for food. He one time kills a lion, and he comes back later, and bees have made honey inside the lion's carcass. And he so wants the honey, if you can imagine this, he reaches into a dead lion to pull honey out to eat out of it. I mean, this is a guy who gave up on God because of his appetites. His appetite for food, his appetite for lust, his appetite for anger. His whole life, he gave up on God. The leader, the religious guy, gave up on God because of the secret appetites in his heart. Well, finally, a woman named Delilah, a Philistine. He was supposed to deliver the people from the Philistines. Instead, he was dating them. He dated Delilah, and she was commissioned by the Philistines to find out his secret. Now, his hair was not magic. It was not magic. It was a symbol of a vow he made called a Nazirite vow, which said he would not touch dead things, that he would not get drunk, and that he would not cut his hair. He'd already broken the first two. The only thing left, though he had given up on God, was that God said, okay, I'm not going to give up on him. I'm going to be patient towards Samson. Well, One night, Delilah cut his hair. And God said, all right, Samson, if you're going to run from me, I'll step away and let you feel the consequences of that in hopes that you will eventually turn back to me. Well, the Philistines were cruel, as I told you, and they not only were cruel to the ordinary peasant folks, but they were cruel to him. They gouged his eyes out. They gouged his eyes out, and they made him work like a mule, pushing the grain around. And over the next couple of years, well, he will feel so lonely and so enslaved and so in bondage. He will be physically blind, but for the first time, he will open his eyes to his self-centered life. For the first time in his life, he'll think about what a waste of all the resources and all the talent and all the skills God had given him. In the midst of his darkness, in the midst of his blindness, he'll say, God, man, I gave up on you. I live my life for pleasure. I live my life for fame. I live my life for everything but you. And God, if you'll have me, I want to hope that you are a God who won't give up on a religious guy who had hidden secrets in his life. And he finds a God that though Samson gave up on him, God didn't give up on Samson. And Samson will restore his strength. God will restore Samson's strength. And he will deliver the Philistines. In one day, he accomplished more in the victory and liberation of his people because of God's strength than all the years before. And that's the time of the Judges. But the theme continues. Because as we come out of Judges, we come into the book of 1 Samuel. In the book of Samuel, we find that another way that we give up on God is because we don't listen to him. I know for me, I often just become too busy for God. I know he's my creator, he made me, he's made the universe, but I'm too busy for him. He doesn't quite fit into my calendar. You see, we give up on God by not listening. The book of 1 Samuel begins with a woman named Hannah, a woman too who is barren. And she is weeping before God. God, please hear me. I so want a child. I so want a child. Don't give up on me. I'm not giving up on you. So God comes to her and says, I want to give you a son, and his name's going to be Samuel, and he's going to be a priest. And she is so delighted that God has heard her, that God never gave up on her, that she puts her son Samuel to be a priest, training under the current priest Eli. One night when he's a young man, possibly a teenager or an early young man, a voice comes in the middle of the night, says, Samuel, Samuel. And he runs to Eli. Eli, did you call to me? Eli. No, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. Again, the voice. Eli, did you call to me? Eli says, maybe it's God. Eli says, I gave up on God speaking to me a long time ago. You see, Eli was a religious man, but in his goodness and in his corruption, he had become incredibly corrupt. He hadn't heard from God for a long time. The priest was corrupt. The priest had not heard from God. So he says, well, if God speaks to you, say, speak, Lord, your servant listens. And sure enough, God spoke again. And Samuel said, I'm listening, God. He said, I want you to tell Eli and his sons that they have given up on me. Oh, they may be religious, they may have credentials, but their hearts are not for me. And tell them that you are going to be the new priest. Because I'm seeking people who will not give up on me, but will listen to me and will heed me. And so Samuel listens. And Samuel leads the people, the nation, to understand a God who doesn't give up on us, even when we give up on him. And as he leads the people back to God, they say, you know what we need? We don't need to listen to God. I mean, that's nice. But what we really need is a king. What? A king. The Judges didn't work. The Moses thing didn't work out. We need a king. And Samuel comes in 1 Samuel 8, he says, all right, I'll ask God, but I don't think it's a good idea. So he comes to God and says, God, the people want a king. And God says, forewarn them. What happens when you get a king government? You do not want a centrally controlled monarchy. You don't want it. And he gives all kinds of specifics. He will take what is yours and he'll make it his. He'll violate your property rights. He'll tax you to death. He'll take a tenth of your grain and a tenth of your oil and a tenth and a tenth and a tenth. He had all these tenths up. He says, if you have a large monarchy government, you are in trouble. Don't do it. They violate your property rights. They take away your prosperity. They take away your generosity. Don't do it. They take away your sons and daughters. They take them to their wars. Samuel comes to people and says, guys, let's listen to God. He says, we don't want a king. And they say, well, those are nice warnings, but we'll take a king anyway. And they do not listen to God. But what's amazing about God is even when the people give up on him and do exactly what he said not to, he says, all right, you're going to regret this, and you're going to turn back to me and say, we should have listened, but I'll work with you. So he sends him a king. So Samuel comes and delivers him a king. And they have a big ceremony, and they have all the luggage stacked up on the sides as people gather from all around the world all around the countryside, I mean. And he says, all right, I have a king for you. And this man is a servant. This man thinks of other people. He's not a lover of the limelight. He cares about people. He's a servant leader. Introducing King Saul. And they can't find him. It's a little embarrassing. Where's King Saul? And they find King Saul hiding behind the luggage. And he comes out, and he's not really what they expected. He's a servant. He's not a limelight lover. And many people say, no. That's not it. And they give up on God's plan. We want a king, but not that guy. So half of them say, we're not going to take God's king. We're going to give up on what God provided because we know better what a king should look like. We don't want the guy that's hiding behind the luggage. Well, at that very moment, all of a sudden, there was a call to go to battle. So Saul turned to the people and said, who's with me? And half the people said, we'll go. And the other half of the people said, we won't. We're not following you into battle. What kind of a king are you? And those who followed Saul into battle had an incredible victory. They came back victorious. And as they came back victorious, can you imagine what happened? I bet you can. Those who went with him, those who were obedient, those who did the good works, thought they were better than the people who hadn't obeyed. You see, the thing about building your life on good works is you get really proud and arrogant, and you look down on people who do things wrong. And that's what they did. We are the good people. We are the people who trusted God. We are the people who trusted Saul. And therefore, the net result was, let's kill off the bad people. Let's kill off the people who didn't obey. Let's kill off the people who did the wrong thing. And Saul is so gracious. And Saul is so smart. And Saul says the message of God unites good people and bad people. The message of the Bible says your good stuff was not good enough for God. Your bad stuff was not good enough for God. But even though both of us have given up on God, he hasn't given up on us. And he says this, he goes, today is not a day to be about us, what we did do or didn't do. Let's make this a day about what God has done. And he unites the people. And rather than dividing the kingdom in half, he unites the people together into one common kingdom. And the message is clear. From Joshua all the way through 1 Samuel, we give up on God, but he doesn't give up on us. And the key takeaway for you and I this morning is that, don't you give up on God? Don't you know that you ought to be honest and you ought to love people the way you love yourself, but you don't really do it? Wouldn't you say to somebody else, hey, gossiping's wrong, and then you find yourself gossiping? I do. Don't you find yourself saying no, to your kids, no, don't lie, don't fudge the truth, and then you're talking to your wife and you're fudging the truth? We give up on God. So here's the key takeaway. Here's what I'd like to encourage you to challenge yourself with in the next few weeks. It's time to give up on giving up on God. It's time to give up on giving up on God. If that means giving up on the fact that he's not big enough to handle your problems, maybe this is the year to give up on giving up on God. Maybe this is the year you're going to give up on grumbling. You're going to say, I grumble and I complain and I think I know better than God. I need to call that what it is. I'm giving up on God, and I need to start giving up on God. Maybe it's not listening. Maybe it's outer rebellion. Maybe it's addiction. Maybe it's being controlled by your appetites. Maybe it's a lack of service, thinking that God's here to serve you instead of you're here to serve him. Maybe you, like Rahab, think, well, I've given up on God because I know he's given up on me. Chad, you wouldn't believe the things I've done and the things I've said. Maybe it's time to give up on the idea that God's given up on you. See, God can merge you. God can find you if you'll give up on giving up on him. Ray Charles read a story in his autobiography, Brother Ray. He was at the peak of his success, peak of his career. He had success, he had fame, he had #1 hits all over the place. He had it all. He had the resume, he had the dream, he'd fulfilled all his goals plus some. And yet he said inside he was miserable. Because inside he knew he had given up on God a long time ago. He had tried to replace God with wealth and with fame, and it just wasn't satisfying the deep longings of his heart. He found himself more and more needing to medicate his pain and medicating the fact that he wasn't finding what he was looking for. He got into prostitutes, he got into cocaine and drug addiction, and his life was just spiraling out of control. Friends would come to him, his family would come to him. What are you doing, Ray? But he said there was a pivotal moment in his life when he went back home. And he met a woman named Mama Beck. She was a real strong Christian. And she pulled him aside as only a woman that you grew up with could. And he said, R.C., what are you doing? What are you doing? Your life is spiraling out of control. You need to quit. You need to give up on giving up on God. What would your mama say if she saw you? And she began to share the message of the Bible with Ray Charles. That though he had done terrible things and though he had driven his life into a ditch, she spoke of a God who doesn't give up on us when we give up on him. And Ray Charles said that she got done talking, he collapsed into her arms and he just sobbed and sobbed, he said, for hours. And she didn't even say anything, she just held him. And she was able to show him the grace and comfort and patience of God just by being there with him in this moment when he, like Samson, looked at all the years of damage, all the years of loss, all the years of regret, and he, for the first time, decided to give up on giving up on God. I want to invite the band to come up. And maybe this is the year that you want to begin to understand the main message of the Bible.